What is it about inked pages that clicks? The mood sharpens, the characters pop, and the world feels alive. I guess that's the power of inking. So today, in Panels in Progress, we're going to talk about the absolute essential step in comic making, inking. Whether you're working on a manga style comic or you're getting ready for the coloring phase, we're going to explore the different techniques, famous artists, and their wildly different styles. And we're going to talk about how to make inking yours, how to express your vision with ink. Welcome back to Panels in Progress. I'm Chris. Today we're taking that penciled energy and turning it into clean, expressive, final art. Remember, inking isn't tracing. It's where mood, rhythm, and clarity come together. It's where you decide how the world feels, how soft or how gritty your characters are. And you can decide how much punch your page lands. It doesn't matter if you're inking digitally or traditionally with thick lines or whisper thin details. This is where lines really help tell the story. Before I get into the meat of the podcast, I wanted to remind you guys that this podcast is mostly to put on in the background. I don't know if you're like me, but when I am working on my comic or just drawing in general, I like to have something interesting to listen to while I create. And what better thing to listen to than someone talking about the process of making comics and their experiences with it. So if you're interested in that, please pull out your sketchbook, pull out your iPad, or whatever you happen to be working on, and listen to the conversation while we go through this topic. I guess we should start by saying, what is inking really? Inking is the translation of your pencil lines. It clarifies the form, emphasizes key elements, sets the mood through texture, line weight, and direction. Every mark has a meaning. It can make a moment feel loud or quiet, intense or subtle. It can hold your attention with all the detail, or it can progress the story forward if it's an action scene. When the inking is well done, it can make your art readable at a glance. It can guide the eye through the page, and it defines your style and tone. Now, full disclosure, I am not a professional when it comes to inking. The next couple podcasts, you'll see that. I am still learning in this phase, and inking is something that I am really wanting to focus on in the future. I love expressive, detailed inks, but I also enjoy simple inking and differentiation between line weights. I'm a fan of all the different techniques and styles. I haven't yet found my style of inking, but together, let's talk about the differences I've noticed between manga and Western. So when it comes to manga, inking is often the final phase. It's not going to be colored after. In manga, there's usually heavy use of hatching or cross-hatching for tone. There's uses of screen tones to show shadow and depth, but you can also achieve that with your line work. And there's plenty of speed lines, tone gradients, and white ink highlights for those really intense moments. With manga, it seems like there's a rhythm to the ink to express dynamic poses and facial expressions, the energy of it all. A couple of examples of amazing ink usage in manga. Takehiko Inoue for Vagabond. He uses expressive brush inking, heavy use of light and negative spaces. Kentaro Miura for Berserk. He used complex hatching and textures, even in the backgrounds. Miura's work is so detailed at times that sometimes you get lost in how much work he put into it. But the energy of Berserk is felt in every page. Rumiko Takahashi for Inuyasha. Clear, clean line work with strong motion, lines, and gesture. On the other side, for Western comics, the inks are usually prepared for digital coloring. I mean, obviously that's a big difference between manga and Western comics, even though not every single Western comic is colored. You don't have to color your comic, but usually when you know that your comic is going to be in color, you think about that while you're inking. So the inks can usually be prepared for digital coloring Or I know some artists who traditionally ink and they use watercolor after the inks. There's clean lines, high contrast outlines, and less hatching. But that also depends on the phase of that comic itself. Comics back in the day, talking about the 90s, the early 2000s, those comics had a lot of detail. But especially if you're thinking about the bigger companies, Marvel, DC, and even Image as well. More, I wouldn't say necessarily modern comics, but comics of today that tend to lead towards webtoon. Sometimes the inking detail just isn't there because these comics are made just as fast, almost as if a manga schedule, but then they have to add color on top of it. Artists might want to emphasize line weight for depth, texture with different brushes or nibs, stylization over realization. Some examples might include Sean Murphy for Batman, White Knight. He uses bold, gritty lines, heavy brush strokes, dynamic shadows. Sarah Pichelli, Ultimate Spider-Man, clean, subtle lines made for digital printing. George Jimenez, or maybe it's Jorge Jimenez, for Superman, thick to thin, dramatic line weights, speed lines, and motion blur. I always think that the best way to figure out how you want to learn, how you want to ink your comic in the future is to look for comics or manga that share the style that you want to recreate. Share the style that excites you the most, that interests you the most. There's so many different variations, and we can learn a little bit from everything. We can learn from manga, we can learn from Western comics, and of course I'm not excluding European comics as well. There's so many different styles, so many different ways to do it. There is no wrong way of how to ink. It's just what's aesthetically pleasing to you and what's going to be aesthetically pleasing to your audience. And some of that you're going to find out along the way. So it's a lot of trial and error. Alright, so let's get into the tools. You've got, for traditional, there's brush pens, dip pens, microns, and fine liners. Brush pens have a very flexible tip, depending on if it's a refillable or it's a pen itself. There's two different types. The refillable ones you have to keep clean, refill the ink, and really get some practice in with it. But it's great for expressing the line, moving from thick to thin very quickly and smoothly. But like I said, it takes a lot of practice to understand the workings of a brush pen. A dip pen, usually G-Nib, Crockwell, are great for manga, and it's usually a style of control. Just like the brush pen, if you're using a dip pen, you also have to practice on how to hold the pen, move it throughout the page, so that way you have those nice flowing lines and you can transition to some thick to thin as well. It's great for detailing. Microns or fine liners you can use. Usually they come in multiple sizes, so you have a thick size, you have a very thin size, like 01, 005, 03, just depends on what you're looking for. But that fine liner is not going to transition from thick to thin. It's going to stay one consistent line weight. So if you want to add line variation, you have to go back over it and beef up your lines by adding the line weight in. And to be honest, I feel like I was kind of done a disservice when I started learning how to ink, is that I wasn't given a brush pen right away. I wasn't given a nib right away. Those are things that I kind of figured out later in life. The first thing I was given for inking while I was in school was a fine liner. And so as I was learning how to ink, I assumed that the fine liner was doing all the work and that inking just meant that I needed to make sure every pencil line had ink on top of it. And for that, I didn't understand that I needed that line variation to show depth and bring the character to life. So remember, if you're using a fine liner, you need to vary it up. For digital inking, you can choose your software. So there's Clip Studio Paint, there's Procreate, there's Photoshop, there's Krita, Medibang. There's so many different art apps out there. Basically, just use the one that you feel comfortable with. A lot of the digital apps will have brushes pre-built inside of them. Soft brushes, round brushes, inking brushes, paint brushes. Just try to figure out which one works best for you. Custom brushes are also a thing. There's plenty of artists, probably your favorite artists on YouTube are selling brush packs. You should definitely give them a try if you're interested. Some of the brush packs that I picked up was from Mark Brunet, Lucas Piendor, and Chromamoma. I love Mark Brunet's brush packs. He has a free one and then he has one for sale. I got his free brush pack and I use some of the brushes out of there all the time. My favorite brush set is Lucas Piendor's. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he's a great artist. He makes his own custom brush packs. He has a comic brush pack, a comic book brush pack, and an inking brush pack. He also has a watercolor brush pack. But the two that I love the most and use for almost every single comic that I've made since he started creating these packs are from Lucas. They're $20 a piece. They work in either Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop. Definitely check him out. Watch some of the videos of him using those brush packs to create his artwork, and then you'll definitely see why I decided to buy those packs. Talk a little bit about techniques. Next, line weight variation. You want thick outlines for the foreground, thin lines for the background, and that's just to show the depth of view, because everything that is closer to us will be more in focus and have a thicker line. Hatching is great for shadow, emotion, drama. Just be careful with hatching. You can get a little bit too crazy with it, especially if you're not really sure what you're doing. Usually less is more when it comes to hatching, unless you have practiced how to show the progression of light and shadow in hatching form. And then of course cross hatching is a layer on top of that. And I would say with hatching, make sure that you're using the hatching to insinuate the form of whatever the object is. You don't want your hatching to make your image look flat. Spot blacks, use solid black to anchor areas of your page. It helps with balance, composition, and show lighting. Spotting blacks is something that I just recently got into, which is basically you're looking at your image and trying to dictate which part of this picture would be solid black. And if done nicely, it can really accentuate the form and shape of your scene. It can also add a lot of drama to it. I don't know how many comics you've seen that have heavy usage of black. I think I did a panel deep dive on Batman the Black Mirror, which used a lot of spot blacks, and it was masterfully done. If you haven't checked out that video, it's on the channel. It's panel deep dive number 4, Batman Hush and Batman Black Mirror. Check it out if you want to see, if you want to see some examples of spot blacks. And then the last technique is dry brushing, stippling textures, using grit or grunge or mood, and it can be great for horror scenes. It can be great for anything, whatever, like, you want to have a little bit of texture in your artwork. You know, if you have a ground, you don't want it to be just smooth, flat, because that's not real. You want a little bit of mess to show that the world your characters are in is a real world. Common mistakes, common inking mistakes. Here's some things that I try to avoid when I'm inking, and that's tracing over my pencils too tightly. If you've ever wondered how come your pencil line has so much energy, but when you ink something, all the energy is lost, it's because you're following too closely to your pencil line. You want to express the pencil line, not necessarily trace it. Another thing to avoid, over inking every detail and flattening the depth. Basically, I have some practice comics that I did where I cross-hatched everything, inked everything. Everything had a texture. Like, it was so much texture that everything got lost. But I didn't realize it until after I made the comic. It was a great thing to practice, but just something to keep in mind is that not everything needs extreme amount of detail in a panel, much less on a page. Inconsistent weight lines across the page. This could mean, your characters haven't moved positions, but the character that was in the foreground that had the thicker lines is now still in the foreground, but he has thinner lines, and then the characters in the backgrounds have thicker lines. It could be very confusing to your audience or your reader. Not thinking about light source during inking. I've fallen into this trap a couple times where I just was so excited to draw, so excited to ink, that I had no idea what the light source was, where the light should be coming from. And I think we've all fallen victim to, the light is coming from the left or the light is coming from the right, and you just copy paste that all throughout, as far as you never differentiate the light source. So just try to keep that in mind, which would actually work well in your planning stage of the comic for layouts, just to know basically where your light is coming from. And of course, the last thing that you should try to avoid is using a dead line or taking a fine liner and inking an entire page with very little differentiation between anything. Everything is the same line, and that can make your images not only look flat, but also they don't have any life when it's just one solid line for everything. I mean, again, when it comes to trying new things, don't be afraid to try new things. Try, experiment. That's what making comics is all about. Try to figure out what works for you. How can you make inking your style, your way? How can you take a picture and bring it to life through inking? It's going to take some time and practice, but just keep at it. There's no harm in trying something only to figure out that it doesn't work out. Yeah, with inking traditionally, it might be wasted ink, but if you're inking digitally, you have no reason not to try something and then hit Control-Z if you don't like it. Inking can feel intimidating, but it's also one of the most creative stages when it comes to comic making. It's not about creating perfect lines. You don't have to make the line just right. It's more about expressing yourself through the ink, bringing your characters, your world to life, bringing your vision into clarity. So remember, let the ink just be what it is. Try something, try again, whether you're doing it traditional, digital, or just experimenting with a little bit of both. Eventually, you'll have your own inking style as long as you keep going. It can be as simple as you want it to be, or the inking can be as complex as you want it to be. But as long as you have comic clarity, then it's going to work. So that's the podcast for today, guys. Hopefully you guys got a little bit further on your comic while you were listening to me. I'd like to know, what's your inking style? Are you a traditional inker? Are you a digital inker? Do you have expressive lines? Do you like using custom brushes? Or do you even make your own brushes? I'm always looking for some new tips and tricks to experiment with, because we're all still learning together. So any of those things, please leave in the comment section. Subscribe if you want to have more comic dialogue, because this podcast is about the process of making comics, but it's also what we can learn while we read and make comics. We can start a back and forth dialogue, and it'll make all of us better comic artists. Until next time, keep making comics.